Good afternoon. I'm Malcolm Daniel. I'm curator in charge of the Department of Photographs here at the Met, and thrilled to welcome so many of you here today and to welcome our speakers for an afternoon that will focus on the work of Alfred Stieglitz, Edward Steichen, and Paul Strand, the subject of an exhibition that runs through April 10th of this year in the galleries for drawings, prints, and photographs on the museum's second floor. I also want to thank Joseph M. Cohen, whose support has made the exhibition possible. You're here at a good time. Today is the final day that the original autochromes by Stieglitz and Steichen will be on view in that show. And so I encourage you, even if you've visited in earlier weeks or are planning to come back for a second view, to stop up in the gallery and take a look at the original autochromes today. When visitors come to the Met, they can walk up the grand staircase and into the old master galleries and see a room that entirely surrounds them with the paintings of Rembrandt, or walk into our 19th century galleries and stand in a room of Manet or of Degas. And the truth is that the Metropolitan has that same strength in the old masters of photography, but they're not often on view and not often on view together. And so it's a particular pleasure to be able to pull some of our greatest treasures out of the storerooms and to put them on the walls and to have works by Stieglitz, Steichen, and Strand here for everybody to see in depth. Many of the photographs in the collection were donated by Alfred Stieglitz himself, some of his own photographs in 1928, which were the first photographs to enter the collection as art. And then in subsequent gifts in 1933, work by other photographers, including Steichen, and by bequest after his death in 1946, additional works, including those of Strand. In the exhibition, each of the artists has his own gallery, but their stories are interwoven. And it's that interconnection that's the subject of today's lectures, and a time permitting a brief discussion afterwards. Our first speaker is Joel Smith. Since 2005, he's been curator of photography at the Art Museum, Princeton University, a place where he also received his doctorate in 2001. Before taking up his curatorial post at Princeton, he was the curator at the Francis Lehman Loeb Art Center up at Vassar from 1999 until 2005. And he's been the curator of many exhibitions and the author of many publications over the years. Very memorably, the Saul Steinberg Illuminations exhibition and accompanying catalog. The exhibition debuted at the Morgan Library in 2006, and then it traveled to the Smithsonian, to the Cincinnati Art Museum, to Vassar, and then to museums in Paris, Zurich, London, and Hamburg. He's long had a connection with the Metropolitan Museum, having been awarded pre-doctoral fellowships in the Department of Photographs here in 1995-96, and then again 1996-97, while he was working on his dissertation, New York Modernism and the Cityscapes of Alfred Stieglitz, 1927 to 1937. Following his fellowships here, he was commissioned by the Met to author a book entitled Edward Steichen, The Early Years. It's a wonderful book that I highly recommend to you, and it's still in print. Having lectured and written extensively about both Stieglitz and Steichen, Dr. Smith is the ideal person to speak to us today about the relationship between these two great photographers. The title of his talk is Steichen, Stieglitz, and the Art of Change. Please welcome Joel Smith.
Thank you very much. As Malcolm said, it is a great pleasure to have the opportunity to consider these artists specifically in relationship to one another. The exhibition is a great example of the way in which the complementarity of one artist to another, and in this case, a whole trio of them, might be more illuminating than even considering one artist at a time at great depth. It might bring out facets of them that any consideration at any length of an artist on his own might not reveal. What I'd like to do today is specifically to look at Stieglitz and Steichen and the way that their relationship in the period from the turn of the last century until about 1915 formed the initial aesthetic context for understanding the possibilities of artistic photography. And I want to do that not by looking in the broad way at the activity of the photo secession, the 291 gallery or the journal camera work, but by looking first at each artist singly, and then considering in, I hope, a new way, how we can understand the way that their individual motives as artists and as people brought them together into such an influential pair. So it is, of course, conventional to think of Stieglitz and Steichen as the inseparable partners in making photography work in New York around the turn of the century and forward through the institution of the photo secession. And first I'll take a quick tour through the depth and intricacy of those connections between the two of them. We see here the photo secession poster, which is created by Steichen using a photograph of Stieglitz photographing New York City on a bridge. Steichen turns it into a kind of natural landscape, an artist working out under the moon and looking at the natural world. That romance, the idea that looking at the city might be something that connects you back to the wonders of nature and to something like a tonalist view of the world, such as Whistler had introduced, is really at the center of what Steichen brings to this relationship aesthetically. Steichen also brings the design, literally, of camera work, the journal that Stieglitz began publishing shortly after Steichen's return from Paris in 1902 to New York. From his perspective, I think, with Stieglitz in a position to make him a star, and that was very much the way that Steichen approached the opportunity of being back in New York. So he designed the cover of camera work and really set up the template for how the photographs of the photo secession were going to be seen. In the gallery itself, too, which was a space Steichen had been using as his portrait studio and turned over to Stieglitz to run as a gallery, Steichen is of great relevance as the designer of exhibitions in the space, so that simultaneously Stieglitz's sensibility is in charge of programming the institution, and Steichen is creating the look and also sending back from Paris some of the most important works of modern art, not necessarily photography, as Stieglitz put it, that was put on view there. And this becomes very important, the way that photography can be seen in context with other contemporary art. Furthermore, there's an important collaboration in the sense that both Stieglitz and Steichen are very concerned with what they refer to in their letters back and forth between New York and Paris as red rags, as in what you wave at a bull. An example of that is the Picasso drawing that Stieglitz reproduced in camera work, and which plays a relevant role in understanding, I think, the way that Stieglitz began to approach the possibility of being a difficult artist. It was Steichen, however, who really spurred Stieglitz into taking this kind of work seriously and seeing the way that it could fit into a photographic context. I'm just going to grab some water. To consider first Stieglitz then, really in what it is that he as a photographer was doing that made it relevant to him to encounter Steichen when he did. In the 1890s, the significant thing that Stieglitz, I think, was contributing to the notion of artistic photography was an understanding of the possibilities of the hand camera and the way that it changed the relationship between an artist and the frame, which is the starting point of any photograph. Draftsmen begin with a blank page, photographers begin with a frame. And what you do within that frame and how you give order to it becomes the basis of your art. The relevant thing for Stieglitz in photographing New York City, which is the subject matter I'm going to be looking at chiefly in Stieglitz's work, was that with a hand camera you could capture the spontaneity, the action, the life of the city, and yet it raised the problem, how do you impose order on a relatively chaotic scene such as the city presents? The answer for Stieglitz was to use, as he put it in an essay in 1897, rarely more than but a portion of the negative. So that whereas a commercial firm such as the Detroit Publishing Company would provide photographs of Fifth Avenue that looked like this, photographed from a certain distance, the great liveliness of the city, the variety of it all on view, and yet there's a certain anonymity to the relationship of the viewer to the space. Stieglitz was creating images such as this one, The Terminal of 1893. And he did it not by having a different physical relationship to the space himself, but by achieving it in the darkroom. He was at a safe remove, and it was through the secondary act of editing, through the subtraction and through enlargement, that he was able to give the sort of force of a painted picture and the depth of picturesque detail that he wanted in scenes such as this one. Likewise, Winter Fifth Avenue, famously a picture made after a blizzard in 1893, a subject we can all relate to now, is itself an outtake from this larger scene. So the centrality of the wagon coming towards him has a power that it would not have and did not have to him standing there alone. It has to be a matter of thinking ahead to what portion of the scene he's going to use. This deciding beforehand that he's going to be editing his work is central to how he operates. The problem with this approach was that as Stieglitz got more and more busy with all of the things that Steichen was sending back to him to put on view in the galleries and with the work of camera work as a journal, he had less and less time to devote to his own work as a photographer, and yet still had his ambitions. And the result, I believe, is that the work becomes increasingly formulaic, so that if we look here at a work of 1900 and one of 1910, you can see that Stieglitz is doing a similar kind of thing in these pictures that makes sense for somebody who's hedging his bets and trying to think ahead to how he's going to cut the picture up. If you look at these two images, they're both images of deep space out in the city. He uses the street or the avenue as a way to give himself this wide and deep space, with figures in the foreground, with uprights, with a large structure in the background, and with this perspectival view. Here I've divided up into different colors, the sort of structural elements that go into these pictures. And they recur again and again in the relatively few pictures, really, that Stieglitz produced during this first decade of his association with Steichen and with the photo secession. In 1910, 1911, the variations are small. There is an evolution, but it's a very minor one. And I think that Stieglitz was really on his way to being in a rut for the rest of his artistic life. What's compelling is what broke him out of this rut, and he came out of it in mid-career and turned himself into a very different kind of artist, still as concerned with the frame as he ever was, but in a very different way that caused him to look back at his early work in a different way than he ever would have if he had kept on in this manner. I'll list these in 4 parts. First is a single image, the steerage, which he exposed on a ship heading across the ocean east in 1907, but did not discover or did not have pointed out to him as a picture worth developing and printing and making a point of until 4 years later. What's so powerful about this picture as something that he had created in his camera and that used the entirety of the frame is that it doesn't follow any of the formulas that he had been following. It winds up being much more compelling by being this inchoate, very ordered, very beautiful and complex space, but something that you would never have been able to pre-plan or nothing that made any sense to break up into smaller pieces. It was not necessary. The lesson for him was that there was something greater in the moment of making the picture than any amount of later editorializing was going to contribute to the picture. And so the moment becomes what photography is about for Stieglitz. And that's an absolutely thoroughgoing change in the way that he understands how to make photographic art. It affects all of these steps that follow. The next was that as 291 began to run into problems in the 1910s, as camera work got fewer and fewer subscribers, And as Stieglitz realized that there was perhaps an ending to this story he had been involved in, he realized that there was something that he loved so much about the place, about 291 and about the people connected to it, that he felt compelled to begin making images of them. And this is his first great serial project as a photographer, the beginning of a serial idea, which was something that could keep on growing, making one portrait after another with a kind of implicit promise to himself not to repeat, not to resort to formula, because the individuality of the people in front of him, people he knew and admired and loved, introduced the complexity itself, and that gave him something to be true to. Another very powerful idea, I think, that influences all the rest of his art. Stieglitz did not make a self-portrait of himself in this context. He did not make himself one of the men of 291, but he did produce the beautiful views out of the back window of 291, that one of which is on the cover of the catalog for the show, which I think really should be understood as his conceptual self-portrait in the context of 291. Again, applying the idea of the steerage, applying the idea that the complexity in front of you provides some kind of equivalent for the thoughts in your mind that make it so compelling to you as a viewer. The landscape becomes a self-portrait, and this becomes, again, central to the way that Stieglitz understands what he's doing as a photographer of spaces. The third thing was falling in love. Stieglitz was married, had a child, but that began to come to an end when Georgia O'Keeffe came to New York in 1917, and applying these lessons, the serial portrait, the importance of the moment, and the lesson of the emotional attachment that he had been teaching himself in these other photographic contexts, all at once provided a sort of intensity to this relationship through art that lasted through the rest of his photographic career. In O'Keeffe, he had somebody that he wanted to see again and again in one iteration after another, in one detail after another, and it provided the extension of this kind of promise not to repeat himself while remaining true to a subject. And finally, in the 1920s, building again on all of these preceding revelations, Stieglitz discovers the idea of creating an image that is abstract, an image that is a form of self-portraiture in a moment, an image that is entirely about an unrepeatable moment, and isolates all of these as the possibility of making an art of photographs of the sky. And in the so-called equivalents, the photographs of clouds and very often of the sun, which appears there at the top of the central image there, I think Stieglitz understood himself to be approaching a kind of absolute limit of what photographic art could be. Here he is addressing the source of all light on Earth, the very center of the universe of an art that's composed of light. And there is something, I think, equal to Stieglitz's ego in the idea that he could be the one to create an art based on such an idea. It's out of all of these experiences that Stieglitz becomes the very different figure that he is in the 1920s and especially into the 1930s, his final decade as an artist. And it's the lessons of the portraits of the Man of 291, of O'Keeffe, of the equivalents, and of the steerage itself as a sort of initial inspiring moment that photography could teach you something you did not know you had learned, that Stieglitz became the artist he was. Those final great projects of Stieglitz's, I would define as, on the one hand, obviously the city and the country. Here's one of the views from his gallery, An American Place, from 1931. The other subject being images around Lake George and around the house, the family house that he retreated to for a good half of the year. They are also, I think, images of death and life. The New York series as a conscious retreat from, a conscious revision of the idea of a heroic photography achieved in the street, becomes an art instead of views from windows in this case, looking up north to the neighborhood he had grown up in on the Upper East Side, but which was no longer visible from where he was. So here you've got this great area in the sky from which to look down at the city that is your place of origin and the center of your world, and yet the part of it that he was connected to was no longer visible. And despite all the beauty and the great intricacy and wonder of these pictures, I think that the meaning for him personally that I can never get away from is the idea that he's looking at mortality. He described these as images of life. He said, I don't care whether this is beautiful, I simply call it life. But the life that he is referring to, I suspect, is something like the life of a coral reef or perhaps of the writhing mass of creatures that take over when another creature has died. It's life, the remorselessness of life, and its ceaseless flow, despite the death of any of its individual members. In Lake George, and especially in an image such as this one, I think the exact opposite instinct is at work, an absolute celebration of the moment, that moment that he discovered through the steerage as the basis of artistic photography, but seen from this completely personal point of view in a place that meant something only to himself. This is not an iconic destination such as Manhattan is, but something that just has its meaning because of what it is to him. And that it's really sealed through this detail right here to me. This is a picture of the world as seen from a very specific eye location. By lining up the foreground post and the detail on it with the plank in the background, he creates a kind of three-dimensional map of exactly where it is he is at the moment he makes this. There's something very specific, very corporeal about this, despite the fact that it's made with a view camera, that it's not a handheld sort of experience, that I think is all about the sensation of this is something I experienced at this one moment and no other, and it was me being here that made it. That personality and that sense of being alive, I think, is what's at the heart of that great body of work. Now, Steichen is somebody who comes from an extremely different perspective, not a New Yorker, but somebody raised in the Midwest who comes to New York simply on his way to Paris and drops in on Stieglitz in order to show him his work because he knows this is somebody who can really make things change for me. But where Steichen had come from was not photography. He did not have a notion of photography as something to be true to in the way that Stieglitz did. He was somebody who had been painting in high school, who had been involved with art from his youth, and who was training as an lithographer's apprentice at the time that he took off for Paris. He's also somebody who, unlike Stieglitz, was ready to look back to the past and seize on any connection to the past that was useful to him. We see here at the bottom a design that Steichen made for Cascaret's Candy Cathartic, a medicine, a patent medicine of the turn of the century, which is clearly based on Cabanel's Birth of Venus. As a notion of how art might be useful to you, this is about as far as you can get from Stieglitz's notion of what is powerful and worth seizing upon in art. But it came completely naturally to Steichen, and he evinced no kind of regrets about this. Despite the fact that his instincts as a contemporary person and as somebody a good 15 years younger than Stieglitz were completely oriented towards contemporary art, which I would extend as far back as Whistler and as far up as the tonalists whose work he had seen in galleries in Milwaukee. Steichen, as I said, was really conceiving of himself as a painter when he went to Paris, and when he came back was still painting, still had the notion of this as the fate that awaited him. And it was with that in mind that his photography took shape in the particular way that it did. Although a photograph such as this one of the pictures that he had to show Stieglitz when he initially appeared in New York, with this as a basis for what he was doing, was leading ultimately towards the idea of photography as something that was physically as ambitious as a painting was, so that the ultimate aim was to do something that was as imposing, as colorful, as large, and as prone to inspiring dreams as painting was. This he attacked in very concrete ways. He is really the one photographer of that generation who takes, as far as it can, the possibility of using multiple layers of tone in a photograph to create a color image. One forgets sometimes in front of these pictures that they are derived from plain black and white negatives, just like everybody else's. It feels as though Steichen has come from some place where photography can do things that it can't do for other people. A second important characteristic of Steichen that is quite distinct from Stieglitz around 1900 is that he's single, and that he can take off for Paris on the spur of the moment and indulge his enthusiasms for heading out to meet all of the important people that he wants to meet, which is exactly what he does, first in Paris and then when he comes back to New York as a photographer of some of the greats of Europe coming to New York. It's that opportunism that he's able to exploit that makes him as valuable as he is to Stieglitz, and I think the object of some envy on Stieglitz's part, though if Stieglitz was being realistic with himself, I think he would have recognized that his curmudgeonly character would not have been as well suited as Steichen's was to being the ambassador for the photosecession that he was. Folded in with all of this is the fact that Steichen is just plain ambitious, period, which would be why even as imposing an achievement in photography as Stieglitz's photograph of the Flatiron, an image of a building that had gone up while Steichen was away in Paris, would not have been intimidating to him, but might have been a funny kind of challenge for him to say, well, what if we do it like this? This is something like the physical relationship of the size of these pictures. Stieglitz later makes a larger print of the Flatiron, but it's still nothing approaching what Steichen's instinct leads him to do. Not only why don't we do it this way, but why don't we try it three different ways? Not by making three different photographs, but by showing just how little it means to be held down by the information that's in a negative. Working from this single negative, Steichen is able to conjure three different times of day, three different moods, certainly three different decorative possibilities for the way that a picture like this could be used. Moreover, Steichen begins to think in very concrete ways about what the best way is to show photographs, and when he sends Stieglitz his three photographs of Rodin's Monument to Balzac, he includes a sketch that you see at the bottom here, saying, give these a good separation on the wall, fill the wall up, but this is the way that they ought to relate to each other. There's a theatrical dimension here that really goes to the heart of what Steichen was bringing. If Stieglitz was the provocateur, Steichen was the showman who really had the instinct for making the work go as far as it possibly could. As I mentioned, Steichen's influence as an installer, as a designer, and as somebody that really literally created the space at 291 is inestimable. And it's a kind of thirst for sensation that you can see growing in the course of his collaboration with Stieglitz, that by the time he gets to doing the Picasso-Braque exhibition, it's involving all of these elements such as the famous wasp's nest, that really transform the space into a place that makes you think, what is the meaning of form in the largest sense? Let's not just let this art from Europe collide with our American sensibility and say, I thought art was this or that. Let's expand the dialogue to something much broader and ask what the meaning of structure, the meaning of form is in a much broader scope than simply the artistic one. That's a real theatrical turn and a really hats off as a curator to Steichen for thinking in those terms. By 1945, by which time, of course, Steichen is well beyond the orbit of involvement with Stieglitz or any kind of reconciliation with Stieglitz. As a curator at MoMA, he's creating shows such as this one, Power in the Pacific, about the battle for the Pacific in World War II, in which the hand of the curator is so heavy and the voice of the curator is so loud that one might have some doubts about whether that was a wise direction for him to go. He redeemed himself in a certain respect, I think, with The Family of Man in 1955. But here we're seeing Steichen pushing to its fullest what was there all along, which was a fundamental enthusiasm and humanism that brought him out and engaged him with the world in the first place. Something which, again, was invaluable to Stieglitz, whose instinct was to stay inside, wait for people to come to him, and explain to them how little they understood. The other great theme in Steichen's life, which I've just alluded to, is that of continuity. As I said, Stieglitz is somebody who's driven by the possibility of reinventing himself. That's really what defines his career as an artist in this period. Steichen simply carried on. He simply invented a new look for a new era, and as a photographer for advertising agencies and for magazines in the 1920s and 30s, created a look for that era that was as definitive as what he had done for the turn of the century. So that carrying over to an artist like Brancusi is simply a matter of being true to sculpture as a sort of miraculous, more than human presence, in the same way that he had done by making his moonlight exposure of Rodin's Balzac. Likewise, having started out with these Whistlerian dreams of what a woman and a woman's beauty could be in an image, that gives him a great toehold in inventing the glamour of the era that I think we're still living in, really, in which the idea of how you appear in your photograph is somehow the true glamour behind you, that's somehow going to outlive and mean more than the mental image that others might carry of you from everyday life. Ultimately, too, I would say that the important thing about Steichen as an image maker is that, as opposed to Stieglitz, who is fundamentally a hunter, somebody who's looking for the surprise image, for the thing that's going to change his eye and it's going to allow him to say, well, this is really what I had in mind. You hadn't thought of this before, but look what I found. Steichen is really not at his best when he's operating in that mode, and in the one instance that we have from this period of his taking a hand camera out into the world and acting somewhat like Stieglitz, he creates this picture which he then cannot resist turning into as painterly a vision as any of his other images. He's really at his best as an icon maker, I think, as somebody designing the world in front of him in order to turn it into exactly the picture that he wants. Now, as for the collaboration between these figures and how we describe it, there's a number of ways to think about collaboration and to think about the luck of artists in finding one another. One thing that I guess I would say is all art is collaborative art. An artist is never working otherwise than in collaboration with history and with a community of some kind. But at especially lucky moments in the history of art, the history and the community coincide, which is to say, a pair of artists or a group of artists realize that in one another and in one another's influence and activity lies all of the complexity and nuance that they need to create the work that they want to create at that moment. Mark Tansey created this painting, Picasso and Braque, portraying them as the Wright brothers. That's a group of Cubist paintings serving as the aerodynamic material there. That summarizes our understanding of, I think, one of the pivotal pairs of the early 20th century. There's a similar sort of nostalgia, I think, among those of us who really don't know anything about it, for the amazing relationship between Johns and Rauschenberg that transformed the possibilities of American art in the 1950s. I would like to propose today, though, a different way of understanding how Stieglitz and Steichen and their very individual personalities produced something greater than they would have on their own. Which is that they were fab. I don't mean this only comically, though I don't mind the laughter at all, because it was funny to me to see some of the associations and linkages that really made more and more sense as I thought about this certainly kooky kind of notion of how these artists relate to each other. The change that it imposes in our thinking about Stieglitz and Steichen, I would say, is that it means thinking about their achievement as something that's almost an accidental product of these personalities rather than the concerted program of Stieglitz drawing in Steichen or Steichen exploiting Stieglitz to do what he wanted to. It was simply by following what each of them did best that this incredible thing came about that transformed the possibilities of their art thereafter. So to think first about Stieglitz, I think that like John Lennon, there is for Stieglitz a real search for authenticity, for connection to his roots, which for the roots for Lennon meant being true to a kind of rock and roll ideal. It's who the Beatles were when they were at the Cavern that Lennon always referred back to as the benchmark for what value everything was that they did afterwards. For Stieglitz, it's that connection with street photography, with the hand photograph, and with the real encounter with the picturesque qualities of New York itself that lies at the heart of everything he does thereafter. It becomes the basis, ultimately, for what he saw in the steerage, the world giving him more than he could have asked for. There's also this matter of the red rags that you wave at the bull and being a provocateur and providing something that's a little bit too complex for your public to understand. That I think is at the heart of Lennon's work as initially the founding member of the Beatles and then as somebody who's tossing out things that are just a little bit too strange to make sense of the public. This is what expands the vocabulary of the art at hand, and that's what's exciting to them as individuals. It becomes all the more compelling to Stieglitz then to see that in his own work he can do something that's as compelling and as strange as the work that Steichen is sending back to him from Europe. There's also the matter of being transformed at mid-career by the love of a woman who comes along and, as an artist, shows you that there's a very markedly different perspective out there, and that by genuinely, physically falling in love with that woman, and with the possibilities opened up by her body, that you can really transform your life. You can be born again. For Lennon, it meant creating the album Two Virgins. And I think there is a sense here of somehow, it's not chaste admiration of O'Keeffe's body, but I think there is something kind of virginal in the idea of rediscovering nudity as a real personal revelation. This is not just a nude model sent in by the agency. This is that one person. Likewise, in the 1930s, by the time Stieglitz is issuing commandments such as this at an American place, this is a card that that lay on the table at his last gallery in New York, saying no formal press views, no institution, no isms, etc. There's an echo, I think, of the famous lyrics from Imagine that speaks in the two men to the ideal that they eventually arrive at, which is possibly we can step out of the institutions entirely. We can think in such a different fashion that, among other changes, there will be, in Stieglitz's case, a new, fresh American honesty about sexuality and about the powers of industrialism and how they've been, in some ways, very bad. And in Lennon's case, ending the war. With the very different sensibility of Steichen, among the elements that I've talked about is his use of the past, and this, too, is something that's instinctual and obvious for somebody like McCartney. He's willing to look back to yesterday and to think about when he's going to be 64 and how there's a stream of continuity between these things, and that the fact that you're in the enterprise of one kind of music doesn't mean that you need to cut yourself off from what has been done in the past. And this becomes a very powerful kind of sensibility when it's combined with somebody who's devoted to being connected only to his relationship with the audience right now. likewise, the hunger to know what's going on and to be connected to what's going on, whether it's Steichen in Paris, making every possible connection he can, or whether it's McCartney as the single Beatle living in the middle of London and making connections to all of the most forward-looking things going on there, while the married leader of the band is out in the suburbs at his house. It becomes very important in understanding what keeps new blood flowing into this relationship and into the composite character that composes what it is. I would say, too, though, in a kind of sad final note, that who survives, who goes on, and who defines the legacy of this relationship winds up being very important. And I think that without the asperity of Stieglitz to guide him towards more compelling things, Steichen is prone to squishy kind of humanism, which has great success with the family of man, but I think also leads to possibilities for black and white photography in that decade that were possibly not all that they might have been, as affected by his youthful energies, and that likewise without Lenin, without the influence of somebody with a somewhat darker view, whether it's black and white in photography or ebony and ivory in music, there is a loss of intensity that comes through the loss of that individual as a part of the art. I have a final section that's all about how Strand is George Harrison, but I think that I've used my time sufficiently. And I'm going to turn it over now. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. That was terrific. And as people get settled in or out, I'll give you another moment. It's my equally great pleasure today to introduce our second lecturer, Sarah Greenough. Sarah is the Senior Curator of Photography at the National Gallery of Art, where she's held various posts for more than 3 decades now. Her exhibitions and her writings have ranged from the work of the 19th century British photographer Roger Fenton to the photographs of beat poet Allen Ginsberg. And she was recently the organizing curator of Robert Frank's The Americans, which was seen and so appreciated here at the Met in 2009. Most importantly, she is the leading authority on the work of Alfred Stieglitz, about whom she has conducted research for an amazing, more than 35 years, remarkably. She began with a master's thesis at the University of New Mexico, writing about the published writings of Alfred Stieglitz, and then continued to focus on Stieglitz for her doctorate, also at UNM, on Stieglitz's photographs of clouds. Most noteworthy among her many publications on the artist are the National Gallery's exhibition catalog, Modern Art and America, Alfred Stieglitz and His New York Galleries, in which she chronicled Stieglitz's central role as a champion of modern art and photography, and also, of course, her 2-volume catalog of the key set of Stieglitz's photographs, published in 2002. It's a publication that is now the essential resource for any study of Stieglitz's photographs. And equally important, and I'm sure, and eagerly awaited, is her forthcoming 2-volume compilation called Touching the Center, The Letters of Georgia O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz, 1915 to 1946, the first volume of which will appear in May of this year, and is sure to be filled with many revelations and new insight into both artists and, of course, their relationship. Important for today's talk is also the fact that Dr. Greenough was the curator and author of an exhibition and catalog in 1990 at the National Gallery entitled Paul Strand, An American Vision. So I can't think of anyone better to speak to us today about the relationship between Alfred Stieglitz and Paul Strand. The title of her talk today is Alfred Stieglitz and Paul Strand, Mentor and Protégé, Friends and Rivals. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Greenough.
Thank you all. As Malcolm said, I am right now deep into my work on the Stieglitz-O'Keeffe letters, which actually has a new title, My Faraway One, the letters, selected letters of Georgia O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz, only volume 1 of which will be published this May, spanning the years from 1915 to 1933. And because of that work, because those letters are, of course, so intensely personal, I have sort of been focusing in my own mind more and more on sort of the characters of these individuals. So today I want to sort of bring out some of the sort of biographical issues with Stieglitz and Strand. I regret that I don't have any wonderful analogies to the Fabulous Four, but perhaps to a pretty good duo. So, brilliant, charismatic, and intellectually voracious, as well as mesmerizing, deeply informed and widely read, an iconoclast eager to challenge all existing conventions, assumptions, and theories, ambitious, egotistical, and narcissistic, but also endowed with a remarkable ability to establish a deep communion with those around him, immensely articulate, even verbose and bombastic, intense, all-absorbing, at times electrifying, but also prone to hypochondria and melodrama. Passionate and poetic in his discourse, manner, and interactions, a ringmaster who helped transform American art and culture in the first half of the 20th century, but one who did so by freely drawing on the talents of others. Verbose, someone who was dedicated to proving the artistic possibilities of both photography and American art, someone with an eye always focused on the future, on securing his position in American history, and fully confident that his work would be posthumously hailed. Someone who was engaged not only with the art, literature, and music of his time, but also its critical, political, philosophical, social, and theoretical issues. Verbose, someone who was ferociously committed to moral and philosophical ideals, but often at the expense of his relationships with family and friends. Someone who inspired others with his vision and commitment, but who was unwilling to be one among many, who was always a leader, never a follower, and who needed both an audience and acolytes. Someone who was profoundly moved by the visual world and able to transform that experience into deeply compelling images. And yes, somebody who was verbose. These are just some of the adjectives and phrases that have been used to describe Alfred Stieglitz, but nowhere in this list is the word competitive. Perhaps it goes without saying that someone who is egotistical and narcissistic, a leader, not a follower, is also competitive. But I think it's a trait that we need to consider in greater depth, especially when analyzing not only Stieglitz's relationships with colleagues, friends, and even loved ones, but also the evolution of his art. Competition, a desire to lead, not followed, coupled with a voracious visual appetite and a restless need to continually push his art in new directions. These attributes, I would like to suggest, are at the root of the best of Stieglitz's art and his relationship with Paul Strand. Now, both Stieglitz and Strand, of course, drew on a wide variety of sources, but this afternoon I want to focus on just what they were getting from each other. But to begin, I need to preface it with a little bit of prehistory, as it were, on Stieglitz's career. For these traits manifested themselves from the very beginning of his work. Indeed, competition, a desire to prove his accomplishments, to go head-to-head with the leading figures of his time, certainly inspired much of his early art. In the most literal sense, in the 1880s and 1890s, he secured a reputation for himself by submitting his photographs to numerous exhibitions and competitions, from New York to London and Berlin to Bombay, all of which awarded prizes for the best landscape photograph, the best portrait photograph, prizes which Stieglitz eagerly accumulated and very carefully preserved. And with his voracious visual appetite, his desire to excel and be the best, he also studied the work of distinguished artists of the period. Eager to demonstrate that photography could compete with painting, he liberally appropriated their pictorial solutions. And here I've compared a very early Stieglitz photograph, The Card Players, with a very popular painting by the German genre painter Edward Grützner, someone whose work Stieglitz greatly admired in the 1880s. This habit of using the ideas of others, absorbing them, appropriating what was useful, can also be seen in his relationship with James Craig Annan, a late 19th century Scottish photographer who was Stieglitz's exact contemporary. In retrospect, biographers have noted how biographers of Stieglitz, that is, have noted how he and Annan shared much in common. Both were told extensively photographed in the Netherlands and in Venice, and this is Annan's photograph, and this is one by Stieglitz. Both were interested in the photogravure process, and both understood that small handheld cameras, which were scorned by many artistic photographers as the plaything of the lowly Sunday snap shooter, both Annan and Stieglitz understood that they could be effective tools for the fine art photographer to capture everyday life. But this history that we've been told by Stieglitz's biographers may be a bit overgenerous. In the 1890s, Stieglitz was often criticized for following Annan's work and his ideas too closely, with good reason. In 1896, Annan wrote an article in which he extolled the hand camera's versatility, but he also noted, and I quote, that because pictorial photography rarely includes racehorse scenes or express trains, a shutter working at a moderate speed will produce sufficient results. Moreover, he suggested that a certain degree of blur is necessary to convey the feeling of motion in life. The following year, in 1897, in an article that Joel alluded to, Stieglitz wrote an article on the hand camera called The Hand Camera, Its Present Importance, and it's probably one of his most celebrated early essays, in which Stieglitz wrote, and again I quote, "As racehorse scenes, express trains, etc., are rarely wanted in pictures, a shutter speed working at 1/4 to 1/25 of a second will answer all purposes. A little blur," Stieglitz continued, "in a moving subject will often give the impression of motion." His wholesale appropriation of Annan's words is ironic, of course, because only 5 to 7 years later, both express trains and racehorse scenes proved to be two of his most successful subjects. Stieglitz also appropriated Annan's method of distributing his art. In 1896, Annan published a portfolio titled Venice and Lombardy, which included photogravure reproductions of his photographs made in Italy. And in 1897, Stieglitz published picturesque bits of New York and other studies. Unlike Annan, Stieglitz didn't confine his photographs just to images of New York, but also included other of his most celebrated images of the time, such as Gossip Catewick. Throughout his career, Stieglitz's relationship with a few key photographers sparked him to complete significant bodies of work and propelled major changes in his art. One of these other people was Alvin Langdon Coburn, a Boston photographer who was one of the youngest members of Stieglitz's organization of fine art photographers, the Photosecession. For many years, Stieglitz had been justly celebrated for his photographs of New York. We've seen in Joel's lecture his photograph of the Flatiron Building or the street designed for a poster, both from the turn of the century. And for several years, Stieglitz had also spoken publicly about his desire to produce a portfolio of photogravure reproductions of his photographs of New York. Therefore, he must have been a bit surprised in 1910 when Coburn, whom Stieglitz had championed but also mildly chastised as being a favored child who enjoys being talked about, Stieglitz must have been rather surprised when Coburn published a portfolio of 20 photogravures of his photographs. Prefaced with a glowing introduction by H.G. Wells, the book includes views of the city's skyscrapers, its streets, its glittering lights, and bustling harbor. And although the photographs are often dark and moody and heavily inflected with a Whistlerian love of atmosphere, they do have a remarkable formal boldness. Indeed, these photographs were so strong, so widely praised, they prompted Stieglitz to reclaim the subject as his own. He'd not photographed New York for 10 years, but in the summer of 1910, he embarked on a series of photographs of New York with a visual complexity, graphic strength, and energy that was unknown in his earlier work. Most were taken as he commuted from Deal Beach, New Jersey, where his family was vacationing, and thus, like Coburn and countless other immigrants, Stieglitz approached the city from the waterfront. Shedding the muted tones of his work that had characterized his work from the turn of the century, he focused on the icons of New York's modernity, its tallest, newest buildings, including the Singer Building, and he depicted the crenellated skyline with puffs of smoke billowing from its tower as if it was an engine running on full throttle. And as if to sort of demonstrate his prowess, Stieglitz also made his prints almost twice as big as Coburn's. In contrast to Coburn's smaller, more muted image, the city that Stieglitz depicted was a potent mixture of architectonic magnitude and brute strength, of movement, change, and promise. This was the kind of artistic pas de deux that Stieglitz thrived on, and this was the dance that Paul Strand unknowingly joined when he asked Stieglitz to look at his photographs in 1914. Born in New York City in 1890, and thus 26 years Stieglitz's junior, Strand had attended the Ethical Culture School where he studied photography with the sociologist and renowned documentary photographer Louis Hine. In the fall of 1907, Hine took his students to Stieglitz's 291 gallery where they saw an exhibition of work by the Photosecession, including photographs by Edward Steichen, Gertrude Casimir, Clarence White, and others. Although perhaps clouded with hindsight, Strand later remembered that this event was a defining moment in his life, one where he immediately determined to become an artistic photographer. When he graduated from the Ethical Culture School in 1909, he went to work for his father, but he continued to pursue his photography, joining the New York Camera Club, where his interest in the kind of pictorial photography that he'd seen at 291 was further encouraged. Like other members, Strand showed his photographs in the club's exhibitions as well as national and international shows, where he began to achieve a modest level of success. His earliest surviving photographs, such as The Garden of Dreams, which is also called The Temple of Love, are typical of the style, subject matter, and even the kinds of titles of work that was promoted by organizations like the New York Camera Club. But if the Camera Club provided Strand with a darkroom and a method of testing himself in the world of pictorial photography, 291, and Stieglitz in particular, captivated him. He and his friend, the photographer Kurt Bosch, extensively discussed the exhibitions they saw at 291 and dissected each new issue of Stieglitz's journal, Camera Work. And I don't know why it's tilted, but it is. Bosch wrote Stieglitz, Bosch wrote Strand, I think we can agree that Stieglitz, after all, cannot be reached by those who pretend to reach him. Who else has that understanding, that ability of selecting and carefully combining the best? As his admiration for Stieglitz escalated, Strand made repeated visits to 291 to study the new art that Stieglitz was promoting. Through these visits and through his viewing of the sensational 1913 Armory show, this attentive, deliberate young man gradually became more aware of the most advanced European painting and sculpture of the time by Cézanne, Picasso, Braque, Matisse, and Brancusi, as well as the American painters John Marin, Marston Hartley, Max Weber, Abraham Walkowitz, and others. Thus, in late 1914, when Strand finally summoned the courage to actually show Stieglitz his photographs, he was ready not only to hear the elder photographer's criticisms, but also to learn from the experience. As Strand later recalled, Stieglitz explained to him that the lens that he was using to make this photograph, Bayshore, Long Island, made grass look like water and water look like the bark of a tree. You've lost all the elements that distinguish one form of matter or nature from another, Stieglitz told him. You have achieved a kind of simplification that looks good for a moment, but is full of things that will be detrimental to the final expression. In other words, Bayshore, Long Island lacked the specificity, the purity of photographic vision that Stieglitz had come to demand. Armed with these insights, Strand embarked on 3 projects that conclusively demonstrated his break with pictorialism and are among the most innovative art made in any medium in America at the time. The first group, made from 1914 through 1915 and into 1916, was, as he later recalled, about the movement in New York, movement in the streets, the movement of traffic, the movement of people walking in the parks. With their tilted picture planes, layered space, strong formal concerns, as well as their movement and dynamism, these photographs reveal a city in which the physical environment, the streets, buildings, parks, and walkways were as vibrant and alive as the people who inhabited them. Strand wanted to show, as the American artist John Marin had written in the introduction to his 1913 exhibition at 291, that the whole city is alive. Buildings, people are all alive. As Marin continued, I try to express graphically what a great city is doing. Within the frames, there must be balance, a controlling of these warring, pushing forces. Like Marin, Strand wanted to depict a movement that was both abstract but controlled, unified by strong formal pattern, yet expressive of the chaos of the modern metropolis. Stieglitz was greatly impressed by these photographs and reproduced several in his publication Camera Work, but they also inspired him once again to photograph New York. He had not photographed the city since 1910, but in late 1915, he once again turned his camera on New York to reclaim the subject as his own. Yet where Strand looked to Marin or Walkowitz or Mack Weber in his photographs of New York, Stieglitz looked to the far more challenging artist Pablo Picasso. For the past several months, Stieglitz had conducted a silent but salient dialogue with Picasso to understand the role, or trying to understand the role of photography in the age of abstract art. Stieglitz had carefully compared what his colleague, the Mexican caricaturist Marias de Zayas, called photography's plastic verification of fact with Cubist portraits. Revealing his understanding of the Cubist desire to extend forms out into space in order to organize the pictorial plane along new coordinates, Stieglitz posed his daughter Kitty in front of this drawing by Picasso, actually here in the Met's collection, and he echoed the Kitty's hat with its little nubbin on top, which is itself probably a designer's play on the bun in a woman's hair. He echoed that with the bun here in the Picasso portrait. And he posed the artist Charles Demuth in front of another Picasso drawing. A little bit harder to see here, but you can see he's echoed Demuth's ear here with the ear form directly below, right there in the Picasso drawing. And he's lined up this very dramatic part in Demuth's hair with the strong vertical line that's so dominant in Picasso's Head of a Man. He continued this dialogue in his 1915 photographs of New York, made out of the back window. With their compression of space, absence of foreground, stacked and tilted planes, grid-like forms, and study of humble views, not grand vistas, these photographs are remarkably similar to Picasso's Reservoir at Horta, which Stieglitz had reproduced in Camera Work just a few years before. Far less iconic and dramatic than his 1910 views of the city, Stieglitz's 1915 views record the patterning of lights in office building windows or snow on the adjacent rooftops, and indicate that he, like Picasso, was fascinated in revealing the underlying architectonic structure of the city. Perhaps responding to these photographs and unquestionably reacting to the art of Cézanne, Picasso, and Braque, Strand accepted Stieglitz's challenge to create art as radical as the most advanced European painting. In the summer of 1916, he embarked on a bold series of photographs of bowls, cups, and teapots, tables, chairs, and railings, forms that Georgia O'Keeffe said in 1917 were as queer as any I ever saw. Strand made these photographs, he later recalled, to understand the organizing principles behind Picasso and the others, in their organization of the picture's space, their unity of what that organization contained, and the problem of making a two-dimensional area have three-dimensional character. In these photographs, Strand got so close to the objects he was photographing that he divorced them from their surroundings, stripping them of their utilitarian functions and presenting them instead as pure forms. With effort, we can recognize these objects for what they are and begin to read into them a three-dimensional depth, but this depth is insistently denied through emphatic formal repetition and complexity. As with a Cubist painting, we must literally piece these photographs back together in order to understand their nominal subjects. Strand also answered Stieglitz's Cubist portraits in a series of photographs that he made in the fall of 1916. Using a false lens attached to the side of his camera and later a prism lens that took photographs at right angles to the direction the camera seemed to be pointing, Strand made a group of candid portraits of people on the streets of New York. He said, "I wanted to see if I could photograph people without their being aware of the camera, the way you see them in New York parks, sitting around, not posing. With their closely cropped frontal depictions, the photographs give little sense of the environment, and they have no domestic details to soften or dilute the impact of their subjects." Moving in closer to his subjects, he endowed these photographs with a brutal naturalism. He isolated heads against dark backgrounds, detaching people from their surroundings so that they assume a monolithic, even totemic proportions. These photographs have a strength and solidity that was diametrically opposed to the work of the photosecession and miles away from the work he had made only a few years earlier. Stieglitz was deeply impressed with these photographs. He reproduced several in the last issue of Camera Work, published in the summer of 1917, writing that they were pure, highly original. Strand, he continued, has added something to what has gone before. The work is direct, devoid of all flim-flam. These photographs, Stieglitz concluded, are a direct expression of today. As Stieglitz's appreciation of Strand grew, so too did their friendship. When Strand showed Stieglitz his 1915 views of New York, the elder photographer, Strand later recalled, was almost embarrassingly cordial. Strand was a find, Stieglitz told his colleagues, a real discovery. Everything must be done to make him welcome. And Stieglitz did just that. Embracing Strand as if he was a long-lost son, he not only folded the younger photographer into all of his activities at 291 and introduced him to the artists and intellectuals who congregated there, but Stieglitz also shared his private life with him as well, his personal wounds, his emotional fears. Strand repaid the attention, writing several articles in defense of Stieglitz and his art, and acting like a devoted son, he became one of Stieglitz's staunchest defenders. But who was this young man whom Stieglitz championed, and who for the next decade so consistently supported the elder photographer? What was his character? Quiet, methodical, and surprisingly consistent, Strand was, quite simply, a man of great moral principle, with a deep commitment to those less fortunate. Intensely loyal and thorough, he was someone who spoke slowly, reflectively, and, at least according to some later biographers, with a slight lisp. A bit taciturn and deliberate, at times perhaps even pedantic as well as austere, Strand believed in his own rectitude. But he was also someone who, one writer noted later in his life, almost disappears into his art and took such a high moral perch that his contemporaries found it difficult to gain an easy rapport with him. Intensely loyal, Strand lacked Stieglitz's eloquence, but he was far more uncompromising in his criticisms of other artists. And as such, he proved to be the perfect defender for the more brilliant, charismatic, and mercurial Stieglitz. One of the artists whom Stieglitz introduced Strand to was Georgia O'Keeffe, who briefly visited New York in late May, early June 1917. She was initially very smitten, both by Strand and his photographs. On her way back to Texas after meeting him at 291, she told a friend that she just fell for him. While to Stieglitz, she wrote, "I was almost afraid to stay in a room alone with Strand, afraid of myself, not for myself, afraid for him." Strand, too, was very intrigued with O'Keeffe, but after they exchanged a few letters in the summer and fall of 1917, she lost interest in him. When Stieglitz sent Strand to Texas in May 1918 to check on O'Keeffe's welfare and perhaps accompanying her back to New York, He knew that Strand hoped to rekindle his relationship with her, but Stieglitz also knew that O'Keeffe had no interest in doing so. Once Strand arrived in Texas, O'Keeffe wrote Stieglitz that the young man was the most helpless, slow, unseeing creature I have ever seen. You have spoiled him, she chastised Stieglitz. His mother has spoiled him, and I guess above all, he has spoiled himself. Thus, when O'Keeffe got off the train here in Penn Station in New York early one Sunday morning in June 1918, she had no hesitation about whom she had come to see. Leaving behind a bewildered Strand standing on the platform, she leapt into Stieglitz's arms and into his life. The intense infatuation that Stieglitz and O'Keeffe had developed for each other through their letters in the last few years quickly blossomed into a passionate love affair. Just as quickly, too, Stieglitz began to photograph O'Keeffe, as she later said, with a kind of heat and excitement that startled her. As these portraits evolved in the coming months, they came to be about many things: love and devotion, passion and sex, Stieglitz's admiration for O'Keeffe as both a woman and an artist, but they also reveal his understanding of women more generally as both femme fatales and childlike creatures. In addition, they're informed with a deep understanding of the power of the fragment to convey the spirit of the whole, and they're about tactility and sensuousness of touch, as well as Stieglitz's unmitigated joy at discovering a woman who reveled in her own sexuality and had no qualms about expressing it to her lover. These photographs had their roots in Stieglitz's study of a host of artists, from Peter Paul Rubens to Rembrandt to Franz von Stuck to Luce-Lautrec, Auguste Rodin, whose watercolor you see here, actually a work that Stieglitz had shown at 291, and of course Brancusi, another piece that Stieglitz had shown at 291. But if Strand's New York street portraits were pure, direct, devoid of flim-flam, and highly original, as Stieglitz had written, so too were his portraits of O'Keeffe. On first glance, Stieglitz's photographs may seem far removed from Strand's 1916 portraits. Stieglitz was photographing his beloved. Strand was recording strangers. Stieglitz did so with O'Keeffe's complete cooperation. Strand did so without his subjects even being aware their pictures were taken. But both men sought to push photographic portraiture into an entirely new realm. And with their closely cropped presentation, their directness, and the way in which Stieglitz divorced O'Keeffe from her surroundings, isolating her head, neck, and shoulders to create an image that celebrates the individual as a monumental, totemic entity, I'd like to suggest that they also do owe something to Strand's 1916 portraits. This artistic dance between Stieglitz and Strand became even more complicated in 1920 when Strand met Rebecca Salisbury. They subsequently married in 1922. Daughter of one of the self-proclaimed founders of Barnum and Bailey's Buffalo Bill Wild West show, Beck, as she was called, and Georgia were strikingly similar, almost the same age, height, and build. And when Strand began to photograph Beck, his pictures, at least initially, also appear similar in look to Stieglitz's portraits of O'Keeffe. Both men used their portraits of their loved one as an important element in their courtship, as an expression of their love, but also as a way to mine and more fully understand its potentiality. And both made numerous detailed studies of their loved ones' heads, hands, and body. But there are differences. In Stieglitz's portrait, O'Keeffe becomes often transformed into a symbol of his understanding of women as givers of life, as creative, childlike, bewitching, or seductive forces. Although Strand made extremely close-up studies of Beck, even more close-up than the majority of Stieglitz's, There is less of a sense of intense physical passion and more of a sense that a space exists between the photographer and his subject. In part, this may be evidence of Strand's reticence, but in part, too, it seems in keeping with his more humanist approach, of his willingness to allow Beck to express her own personality rather than imposing his understanding of her on his image. Respecting the integrity of his subject, Strand wrote in 1922 that the photographer should go beyond any empty gesture of his own personality made at the expense of the thing or person in front of him. And in his portraits of Beck, she stares out at the photographer and us as if she was seeking to understand herself through Strand's pictures of her. Stieglitz, however, clearly thought that Strand had trampled on his turf. And when Beck went to stay with him and O'Keeffe at their summer house in Lake George in September 1922, he determined to photograph Beck to show Strand how he never repeated himself, but devised new pictorial solutions for each subject. Photographing Beck swimming in the lake, he made a series of truncated nudes that are unlike any of his portraits of O'Keeffe and are among his most accomplished photographs of the decade. Intruding still further into the Strand's relationship, he also suggested to Strand that his portraits of Beck might benefit from the use of an iron virgin. That was a 19th century device used by portrait photographers to keep the head still so that it wouldn't move. While Beck wrote to Stieglitz that she gurgled to Strand over Stieglitz's portraits of her, asserting that they showed how superior we are as a team, Stieglitz, clearly relishing the sexual innuendos, jokingly wrote to Beck, "Wait till Paul puts you into the Iron Virgin and says, 'Now won't you be good? Don't look so hurt. Smile, be natural.'" Although Strand made few portraits of Beck after 1923, no doubt because of Stieglitz's criticism, he and Stieglitz continued this fraught dialogue for the next 10 years. During this time, Stieglitz became ever more engrossed with photographing clouds, finding in the sky the perfect avenue to create deeply evocative and abstract images that expressed, as he said at the time, his feelings about life. Strand, too, sought subjects that would provide him with the intellectual and emotional intensity that his cityscapes or portraits or abstractions from 1914 through 1916 had once provided him. And although he made many strong photographs from the time of trees, rocks, and plants, much of his work failed to have that intensity of the earlier subjects. During this time, Strand continued to champion Stieglitz's work. For example, he helped Stieglitz to secure both the Intimate Gallery, which Stieglitz ran from 1925 to 1929, and An American Place, his last gallery, which Stieglitz directed from 1929 to his death. He also spent a considerable amount of time with Stieglitz at Lake George, especially in the summer of 1929, when Stieglitz was extremely distraught over O'Keeffe's absence in New Mexico. But Stieglitz's own support of Strand during this time was far more lukewarm. He included Strand's work in his important 1925 exhibition of 7 Americans, which sought to redefine the nature of modern American art. But in the 4 years that he ran the Intimate Gallery, he gave Strand only 1 exhibition. And in the 3 years that he directed An American Place, from 1929 to 32, that is, he only showed Strand's work once, even though Strand had helped define the galleries and was one of its principal supporters. During this time, despite Strand's dedicated friendship, Stieglitz repeatedly chastised the younger photographer for failing to produce more meaningful work. And influenced by Dorothy Norman, who thought Beck was coarse and Strand weak, Stieglitz increasingly came to see Strand's work as derivative. As Strand bitterly recalled in later years, When Stieglitz did exhibit his photographs at an American place in 1932, it was in a joint exhibition with Beck's paintings and not a one-person show. Even Stieglitz admitted that it was a diabolical attempt, and that was his word, diabolical, to expose both Paul's and Beck's failings. Although Stieglitz himself admitted that some of Strand's recent work made in Canada and New Mexico were among his best photographs in many years, the elder photographer was angry because Strand, during the depths of the Depression, had come to question the validity of his highbrow approach to art and life. As punishment, Stieglitz did not help hang the exhibition, nor did he produce a brochure or checklist, but instead he openly criticized the show. When the exhibition closed, Strand turned in his keys to the gallery and severed his friendship with Stieglitz. He later recalled, "The day I walked into the photo secession in 1907 was a great moment in my life, but the day I walked out of American Place in 1932 was no less good. It was fresh air and personal liberation from something that had become, for me at least, second-rate, corrupt, and meaningless." So, in conclusion, what, we might ask, was it like to have Stieglitz as a friend or mentor, lover or husband, father figure, or even rival? Georgia O'Keeffe perhaps best summarized it. Toward the end of her life, she wrote that Stieglitz was either loved or hated. There wasn't much in between. If people crossed him in any way, his power to destroy was as destructive as his power to build. The extremes went together. I have experienced both and survived, but I think I only crossed him when I had to survive. It was as if something hot, dark, and destructive was hitched to the highest, brightest star. Thank you.
So I'd like to begin with a question that I'm not sure either of you are prepared to answer, and that is, we've spoken so much about the relationship between Stieglitz and Steichen, between Stieglitz and Strand, which is what you were charged with doing. Is there any relationship between Steichen and Strand? Steichen was still sort of a presence in the gallery, if not physically, then spiritually, when Strand came first to 291. Do we know what each thought of the other's work?
I would pass that off to Sarah.
Really, by the time Strand becomes the major figure at 291, it's 1915, 1916, 1917. And by that point, Stieglitz is really rethinking his relationship with Steichen, and they are no longer close. So I actually really, I've never read, one making comment on the other. I think it would have been probably through Stieglitz, and because Stieglitz's appreciation of Steichen was so much less, I don't.
They were almost mutually exclusive in Stieglitz's view that Steichen represented what was the very best of photography at the beginning of the photo session, yeah, and Strand at the end, and never the two shall meet, is it?
But Stieglitz's mind worked in oppositions, and so to reconcile across a gap that dramatic and regard both as something relevant for photography to be, I think, would have been inimical to his thinking.
In Stieglitz, there are fascinating letters from the 1930s where Stieglitz is faced with mounting bills, storage bills, and starts going through his collection of work by photo secession members and others, in what would then eventually become preparation for giving a large portion of it here to the Met. and just talks about the Steichen photographs as being absolutely false, not something that he wanted to be associated with, not something that he wanted history to remember him by. And during that point, actually, he destroys a fair amount of work, including destroying several early Steichen paintings.
He's also at that point rewriting his own history, isn't he? And so, do we have a sense of him sort of purging his own earlier, perhaps more pictorialist work out of his own surviving legacy, so that he will be seen as a proto-modernist in his early career?
Absolutely. I mean, Stieglitz repeatedly went through his collection of his own photographs, those that he'd taken, and cut out anything that he thought was weak or inferior, or particularly that sort of tied him to the more pictorial aesthetic. So the key set of Stieglitz photographs at the National Gallery, which includes one print of everything that was in his possession at the time of his death, is very much his modernist construction of who he wanted all of us to remember him by. And if you look in the literature from the 1880s and 1890s and just look at the things that are reproduced, or you look through the exhibition records and see titles of things, there are works that that simply haven't survived, that we know nothing about because Stieglitz didn't want us to know anything about.
And it's very hard to believe that he had got rid of them early. Don't you agree? I mean, that is a matter of disposing of them in the 20s and 30s. I mean, it's a later.
Absolutely.
Cleansing.
It's a
Purging.
later purging. I mean, and it is something that he does repeatedly from the teens to his death in 46.
I wonder if either of you would, since this is the end of the week during which the original autochromes have been on view, I wonder whether either of you would speak about the use of the autochrome by Steichen or Stieglitz. This was, the autochrome was introduced to the public in 1907. It was the first commercially viable color photographic process, and it produced color transparencies on glass. And it was certainly taken up avidly by Steichen, and Steichen introducing it to Stieglitz during that visit to Europe in summer of 1907. I don't know whether.
Sure. Well, I think in a way the autochrome looked like it might be a dream come true for Steichen, in the sense that it was a way to reconcile what he did as a painter, which is very coloristic in its nature, with his pursuits as a photographer, that at last there could be spontaneous, live in the world color photography as a legitimate art form. There are notes in his letters to Stieglitz that include diagrams of his plan for being able to project autochromes, to actually build a structure that would make it possible to make a theatrical art of them. And in that sense, I think they would combine all of his dimensions as painter, as colorist, as photographer, and as showman. And certainly he was a very avid exhibitor of them. I think that even the best of his work in color at that point in autochrome doesn't begin to approach the drama of what he was able to do as an artificer in black and white and in color on paper, simply because the dynamic possibilities weren't there. And so I think it mutes the dimension of his work that's most powerful. It's what I was saying about the steeplechase photograph, which is made in 1907, really when he's deeply involved in color photography, that he's not at his best in using that facet of his work. But coloristically, they are amazingly fresh images of that time, and I think the best of the autochromes that were made that I know of are Steichens.
I don't think really Stieglitz didn't work in color. He didn't think in color in the way that that Steichen did. And
there's no opposites in color.
Yes, exactly. And the autochromes that we know that were unquestionably by Stieglitz are not using color as an important critical element. They're just things that usually happen to be in color. And I think that he too felt that his work with the autochrome was not as successful as his other photographs, his black and white.
If there are questions from the audience, there are 2 microphones that are set up in the 2 aisles, and if you have questions for our lecturers, we'd be happy to take your queries.
Actually, I have I guess it's more of a technical question. Could you speak briefly about the type of cameras that they used? I was particularly interested in the comment that Stieglitz began to understand the value of a handheld camera, and what size would that have been? And also, what the shot of the porch in Lake George, the way the lines are coordinated, where would he have been standing to have taken that photograph?
Stieglitz had a variety of cameras. What he meant by handheld in the 1890s was 3 1/4, 4 1/4, or a 4x5 inch Graflex. So nowhere near as small as some of the detective cameras that were being marketed at that time, but still far more something that you didn't necessarily need a tripod to use. So he primarily used the 4x5 Graflex. That's what most of his photographs of the clouds were made with. The 8x10 inch view of the Lake George porch was made directly sort of outside the porch. The ground did slope off in various ways right in front of the house. That's off more to the side. I think it's more level. I don't, I couldn't possibly tell you whether he's having to, stand up on a box in order to take it. He might well have been, because there was a hill coming up from the lake below. I think one of the other really interesting things about that photograph that's not often remarked on is that you notice the way the roof on the porch has been cut away in just that area. And that was something that O'Keeffe had done just the summer before in order to let more light into the downstairs area. So I think it's as much a photograph that's about Stieglitz's relationship to that place, but also the very real presence of both Stieglitz and O'Keeffe within that world and shaping it into something that was their own.
I might mention that all of the photographs in the exhibition are from the collection of the Met, with 2 exceptions. One is the portrait of Strand by Stieglitz, which has generously been loaned by the National Gallery. And the other is a little trio of photographs by Strand, loaned by a private collector, and they show Stieglitz at Lake George photographing the clouds with that 4x5 camera, which is still a fairly bulky thing to be holding, and that's in the case with the equivalents up in the Stieglitz room of the exhibition. Are there any other questions? Yes.
When we look at Georgia O'Keeffe's body, it reminds me of today. They say be very careful when you have anything on the internet, it's there forever. But when I look at her image, I get a slight reaction. I wondered if you could talk about, in any way, how she would have thought about it or what you think about it, just to see your naked picture there. It's something that I think about, and I just wonder about it.
Well, one answer to that, I would think, Malcolm, is in O'Keeffe's writing about the photographs for the publication that was made here at the Met, of which I think is a very even-handed sort of assessment of what it was like to be the subject of that eye, but also to be a person who knew that she was not the person that was coming out in the pictures, that it was somebody else, but that was, in a sense, all right, because it was his independent artistic creation, and that she was going to be doing something quite distinct herself with the landscape that was his, and so forth. The thing that's powerful about those pictures to me, and that perhaps is the frisson that you're talking about as well, or a part of it, it has to do with the way that they're about the weight of the body, about the dimensionality of the body, and that which actually I always feel in the images of Beck are really not there. You don't have the same sense of a person being substantiated in space somehow as in Stieglitz's pictures of O'Keeffe. It doesn't seem to be maybe as urgent a psychological motive at work somehow. They feel more pictorial to me, although I agree, as you said, that they're powerful images. I immediately have a sense of a less sort of intense encounter with a living body than with O'Keeffe.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think the frisson, to use Joel's word, really comes from the extraordinary sense of tactility, of touch, of sensuality, of passion that Stieglitz has for O'Keeffe. I mean, I think the other point to make about O'Keeffe's assessment of those photographs, well, first of all, the 1978 book of the Stieglitz portraits of O'Keeffe was published with O'Keeffe's complete cooperation, and so the selection of images in there, which includes many of the nudes, was certainly done with her full blessing. But more than that, interestingly, when O'Keeffe deposited Stieglitz's photographs in museums around the country in the late 40s and early 50s, she gave most of the museums, the National Gallery, the Met, the Art Institute of Chicago, and others, just gave outright all the Stieglitz portraits of her, but she kept on loan, she gave outright all the Stieglitz photographs of everyone else, but she kept only on loan from her the portraits of her because, you know, they were so intensely meaningful to her, and she didn't give the National Gallery the 330 portraits of her that we have by Stieglitz until 1980. So those were something that she was very slow to part with because they were so significant to her, I think.
Not to put you on the spot, but in working with the letters, which has to have been and must still be a fascinating process, is there any single outstanding thing to you that has changed in your sense of their relationship, specifically coming from the letters? I'm not asking about individual factual points, but in the dynamic.
It's very hard to summarize that. The letters go from 1915 to 1946. During that time, they exchanged 25,000 pieces of paper. So when I repeatedly emphasize Stieglitz's verbose nature, there's a real reason. One sees in that the correspondence the evolution of a relationship between two people in a way that I don't know of any other body of letters reveals that. So you see both of them going through extraordinary changes in their lives. It's very, very hard to summarize. I mean, briefly, one of the things that's fascinated me in the early letters is people have often talked about, and I've alluded to it, Stieglitz's tendency to treat O'Keeffe like a gifted child, and he repeatedly refers to her in the letters as the great child, as if this was just purely her art was purely an intuitive reaction that she had. That there was no intellectualizing behind it. One of the fascinating things in the early letters has been to see how it's really O'Keeffe who initiates this thought of herself as the child. O'Keeffe who says to Stieglitz, "I'm just the child. I wish you would hold me in your arms tonight, rock me to sleep, comfort me." So to see that she's first putting that notion forward has been fascinating.
I'm curious about the relationship of their photography to vernacular photography, sort of with contemporary photography and art photography seeming to totally converge more recently, and the emergence of their work at a time when photography was becoming quite popular, real photograph postcards and things like that. What did they feel about what was going on, and how actually did they look at the popular component of photography?
Well, Stieglitz certainly commented copiously on the point, as he put it, that you shouldn't mistake the fact that you've received a camera for Christmas for a license to be an artist, and that the spread of cameras into the general population was, if anything, going to drag down the reputation of photography as a potentially expressive or transcendental medium. The great gift of Steichen to Stieglitz, I think in Stieglitz's eyes, was whether he had thought of looking for such a thing before or not. Here was somebody who had the abilities of a painter, who had the instincts of a painter, of a fine artist, and yet chose to use the camera as his medium. It was the best guarantee that this would be somebody uninfected by these popular strains in photography, and somebody oriented towards doing something dramatically distinct from the everyday diaristic sort of use of the camera. I think it's the thing that prevents Steichen from developing that muscle to photograph live, to photograph in the world in, I think, the relatively free way that Stieglitz was able to do in the 1890s and into the 1900s, is that he served so well this role that whether it was mapped out by Stieglitz for him or it just looked to him like the perfect niche to occupy, was the one that it was certainly best for his career to pursue.
I think so much of pictorialist photography in general and early photosecession photography is absolutely in contradistinction to the snapshot. The Kodak having been introduced in 1888, if you wanted to show that you were an artist, how do you distinguish yourself from what everyone else does? And part of that has to do with your choice of subject. So part of it is the medium that you choose to print in, that you make a platinum print or gum bichromate. And Steichen was, absolutely an incredible master printmaker with photography, and that you could do things that the snap shooter, that the Kodaker couldn't do, and that was how you distinguish yourself as an artist, the aesthetics, the materials, and the subjects.
While Stieglitz did, of course, absolutely separate himself from the Sunday snap shooter, and would very disdainfully, particularly later in his life, write about people calling themselves a photographer but not having the ability to really see, by which he meant to be able to extract from the world those symbols, those scenes that have powerful personal meaning. But I think it's also significant to think about the impact that the whole vernacular hand camera movement had on Stieglitz's understanding of the serial portrait, which Joel alluded to briefly, and certainly which is the basis of a lot of the O'Keeffe portrait, that idea of recording someone over and over and over again in order to depict their many selves. And at the turn of the century, Stieglitz had done something very similar in his numerous photographs that he had taken of his young daughter Kitty, some of which he published in a magazine at the turn of the century called The Photographic Journal of a Baby. And they look to a great extent like anybody else's picture of their child in the baby carriage and on the beach and playing with the ball. So it definitely was having an impact on them all.
Take one final question if there is one. Otherwise, okay.
May I just
Sure.
Since he was a great champion of people who were not discovered yet, and he found them, how could he change his opinion of their work so radically, after knowing them? Because, of course they develop, but the work that he liked remains the same. And also, the second part of the question was, when he photographed O'Keeffe, was almost a marketing, it was a way to propel his photographs up into the public eye because everyone would write about it.
Why don't we treat those as two separate questions? You could answer, but I think the answer to your first question, which was how could Stieglitz change his opinion so dramatically about Steichen's early work, I think the answer is that he was a different person by a decade later. He himself had seen so much new art, in fact, the art that Steichen was sending back from Europe, that his eyes and his ideas had changed about what could be great in photography. And so it was a measure of his own growth and his own changes, not specifically about Steichen, but about what photography could be, that made him evaluate Steichen's work differently.
I think you can never also write off just the sense of the importance of loyalty to Stieglitz, which meant not only loyalty to him personally, but fealty to his ideas of what was important in art. And when Steichen went on from making what you might see on the one hand as very powerful personal portraits of, let's say, Rodin and Richard Strauss, to making celebrity photographs of Hollywood stars, which for Steichen is a matter of doing the same thing in a new context, in a new visual language. For Stieglitz, that was apostasy. It turned out that the story was not about what it might have been about in the beginning, and it tainted everything that had come before, I think, for him to understand that this is what that was prefaced to. I would also say that in relation to his own early work, the great gift to Stieglitz from the medium of photography was that the negatives were still around and that he could make contact prints on gelatin silver paper of pictures which had been intended to be large, relatively fuzzy, loose, edited exposures. So he was able to rewrite who he had been as an artist as well, and he made great use of that opportunity in his two one-man exhibitions at An American Place.
Because you said he did that with Strand, too. He liked him and then he did.
As far as Stieglitz's portraits of O'Keeffe being made to shock, to scandalize, I think that the portraits sort of naturally evolved out of first the series of photographs that he was making of mainly the men at 291, as O'Keeffe referred to them. But then once O'Keeffe moved to New York and they began living together, as I sort of briefly alluded to, the portraits became this dance between Stieglitz and O'Keeffe that they were performing, and it was a sort of, I think, a very integral part of their literally, physically coming to know one another in those early years. Stieglitz first showed the photographs in 1921, and they elicited a lot of attention then. He had shown O'Keeffe's work in 1916 and 1917 at 291, but he didn't arrange any exhibitions of her paintings until 1923. And a lot of the critical reaction to her abstract paintings in 1923, if you read it, it almost sounds as if these people are talking about Stieglitz's photographs of O'Keeffe. They start describing sort of the voluptuous contours of her paintings, the cleaving forms, and O'Keeffe clearly was stung by that kind of very sexual interpretation of her paintings, and rarely posed nude for Stieglitz after 1923.
Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
And please visit the exhibition.